Part 2nd. Section 1. History teaches that all communities are liable to deterioration, and the histories of all sections of the visible church, into which she has been unhappily and sinfully divided, proves that they do actually degenerate. As any church increases in numbers and wealth, in the same proportion she declines in spirituality. Her testimony becomes less offensive to the men of the world, and then the men of the world begin to court her influence and enter her communion as a step towards securing the objects of their desire. When Jeshurun waxed fat, he kicked. 10 tribes of Israel revolted from the house of David. The honors and emoluments lavished upon Christian bishops by Constantine prepared the way for the Romish apostasy and superinduced the Dark Ages. On the other hand, the Lord has never left himself without a competent number of witnesses to contend for his cause against all who assail or forsake it. The appearance of these always occasions popular commotion and often revolution. When faithful contending becomes earnest contending, the result is actual war in heaven. Revelation 12, verse 7. We are too liable to forget, and what is worse, too many among us are too ready to question the truth of 2 of the first and plainest facts of the Bible. That in the human family 2 seeds exist, the, quote, seed of the woman, unquote, and the, quote, seed of the serpent, unquote. And that God, at the beginning of our history, quote, put enmity between them, unquote. Yet these facts were taught and emphasized by our Lord during his public ministry, John 8, verse 44. And our best divines worthy of that name, following the Master's teaching and, quote, abiding in the doctrine of Christ, unquote, used to tell us that this is a, quote, war of extermination, unquote. I know that this doctrine of our covenant fathers, of Christ, of the Bible, is seldom taught in our age, because few of their sons believe it. And here, I humbly suggest, may be discovered the real source of all the alienations and divisions that exist in the visible church at the present time. We have many such prophets as those described by Micah, quote, that bite with the teeth and cry, peace. And he that putteth not into their mouths, they even prepare war against him, unquote. Samuel Rutherford was well acquainted with this class, as often appears in his letters. In his day, 1650, the, quote, public resolutions, unquote, developed a vast number of such prophets, whose worldly policy prepared the way for the Act Recissory, which overthrew the whole fabric of both the First and Second Reformations in Scotland, England, and Ireland. The bloody House of Stuart, for 28 years, were wroth with the remnant of the woman's seed, who courageously resisted unto blood, striving against sin. This remnant alone kept the word of Christ's patience in the furnace of persecution, and afterward, in the time of compromise with the Prince of Orange, when, at the Revolution's settlement, the national church surrendered her independence, submitting to the yoke of Erastianism. The Society people, for 16 years after Mr. James Renwick's martyrdom, preserved the testimony of the witness in its integrity, until Mr. John Macmillan became its official standard-bearer in 1706. With the assistance of Mr. John McNeill, licentiate and the concurrence of the Society people, Mr. Macmillan renewed the Covenant's National and Solemn League at Alcansau, near Douglas, Scotland, in the year 1712. For his faithful contendings against defection in the Revolution Church, he had been suspended and then deposed from his office by his brethren. All ministers of the Reformed Presbyterian name have derived their office from him, or rather, from Christ through him. These covenants comprised the whole of the Reformation, from popery and prelacy, and were a testimony against all the corruptions of both those anti-Christian systems. This is manifest from the enmity of the serpent's seed to those documents, by consigning them to the flames. Now, although the Lord had stopped the bloody career of the Stuarts, and had influenced the body of the people to invite the Prince of Orange to occupy the vacant British throne, the persecution of the witness who stood to the covenants, though mitigated, had not ceased, nor has it ceased up to the present day, in the case of their legitimate successors. In all such cases, and in all ages, the backsliders of the Church take the lead. This is clear in the pretended censures imposed upon Mr. Macmillan by his ecclesiastical brethren. But their malice appeared still farther in the attempt of these brethren to move the civil authorities to proceed against him. The civil powers, already satiated for the time with the blood of the martyrs lately shed, refused to be the tools of the ministers against Mr. Macmillan. Thus the earth helped the woman. In such circumstances of hostility from the church and peril from the state did our ancestors venture to renew our covenants in 1712. Their fidelity in that transaction has often been endorsed by pretended successors who were not prepared to own the obligation of their public deed. Take the following example from Reformation Principles Exhibited. Quote, "Discipline was relaxed, immorality and heresy were tolerated in the church, and the remembrance of the Reformation was fast declining. Those who defended the good order of the church against their apostate brethren were sure of being censured by the majority. The faithfulness and zeal of Mr. Macmillan provoked the indignation of those who were conscious of the badness of their own cause. They determined to banish him from a flock who sincerely loved him, and they consequently passed against him a sentence of deposition from the ministry. Against these cruel and unjust proceedings Mr. Macmillan protested, and the ministry which he had received in a regular manner from the Lord, he refused to resign to the caprice and wickedness of men who had no crime to charge him with except his faithfulness to the principles of the Reformed Presbyterian Church. The societies called him to the exercise of the ministry among them, and he was afterwards joined in that work by others. Those who had for a long time, 16 years, been deprived of the public ordinances were now greatly refreshed by the preached gospel. They rejoiced that an organized visible church was again to be found in the land, upon the footing of the once glorious Reformation. This visible covenant society was indeed small and despised. They resolved, however, as witnesses, to maintain a faithful testimony, and, like their brethren, the primitive disciples, to go forth to their Redeemer without the camp, bearing his reproach. They considered that the principles of the Reformation were still as true and as valuable as they had been when they were embraced generally in the three kingdoms of the Isles of Britain and Ireland, and when they were admired by all the Protestant churches of Europe. They sincerely lamented their own inability to introduce them advantageously to public notice, but they were resolved in their humble sphere to collect them faithfully, to bind them up in one testimony, and to seal them as the law of the house among the disciples of our Lord. They took pleasure in the dust of Zion." Unquote. Now, can any one indict a better encomium of our fathers' fidelity, or frame a more explicit approval of their transaction in renewing our covenants at Alcansau? Would it not be a breach of charity to doubt their sincerity? But true charity rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth. The truth in this matter is that the very men who expressed and put on record the above-quoted encomium and approbation of the Alcansau deed were the first to expunge it from the terms of communion, where it had stood from 1712 till 1806. In confirmation, if necessary, of the truth now stated, the reader is confidently referred to the book itself. He will not find the renovation at Alcansau among the terms of communion in any copy or edition of Reformation Principles exhibited since its first issue in 1806. There may be easily discovered the first organic, fundamental, and doctrinal departure from our covenanted Reformation in America, and as a necessary consequence from declension in doctrine, the practice of occasional hearing followed, an unfaithful, self-contradictory practice, subversive of all reformation. I know that these statements must be offensive to backsliders, but if their offensiveness result from their truthfulness, then their statement is more necessary on my part, as well as for their spiritual benefit. But it is proper to notice here the sentiments of the same men, respecting the subsequent proceedings of those who succeeded the men of 1712. I quote again from the historical view, one of the three parts of the plan upon which Reformation Principles exhibited was projected. Quote, "The Reformed Presbyterian Scotland did in the year 1761 publish an act, declaration, and testimony in behalf of the doctrine, worship, discipline, and government of the Reformed Presbyterian Church. The object of this publication was to exhibit a correct statement of their own principles and to defend them by just reasoning. They relate the various steps of Reformation in Scotland. They express their approbation of the conduct of the faithful martyrs. They disapprove of the constituted authorities in Britain, and they declare their unity with the Reformed Presbyterian Church, solemnly recognizing the full obligation of the covenants upon themselves and their posterity. This publication is considered as a bond of connection among themselves, and one of the terms upon which they join together in ministerial and Christian communion. It is a valuable document of the Church's faithfulness. It is an excellent means of handing down to posterity in every nation a just account and an able defense of the contendings of the witnesses against the man of sin. This testimony, in common with the ecclesiastical standards compiled by the Assembly of Divines at Westminster, the National Covenant of Scotland, and the Solemn League of the Three Kingdoms, England, Ireland, and Scotland, affords a scriptural defense and a full exhibition of the Reformation in its best state." Unquote. All this eulogy and strong expression of approbation of a judicial testimony, which they were actually engaged in, means to supplant. I know that this heavy charge is denied, and we are often told there is no difference between the, quote, two testimonies, unquote. If so, where is the need of two? Quote, "Oh, but there are peculiarities in the Scottish testimony," unquote. Very true, and that is the very reason why it must be supplanted. It contains some peculiar and external principles which refuse to bend to any political expediency. There is the difficulty, and to those whose earthly politics change with the times, the difficulty has been, and always will be, insurmountable.